Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about village life, pre-contact, by which we mean pre-contact with Russians and other Europeans and Americans. Traditionally, villages of Sugpiaq people appear to have been about 100 to 200 people, and some of those villages don't exist anymore, but a lot do. And you would have had, but traditionally they would have looked very different than nowadays. Nowadays, people are living in, again, houses that look like anybody else's houses, more or less. But traditionally, you had these multi-family houses where up to 20 people could live inside. Villages were presided over by a tujuk, so a type of leader. It was in theory an inherited position. However, you could lose the position if you lost sort of the trust of the people. And that tujuk, that leader, as well as his second, the sakanjik, would help make sure that hunting was done in certain ways, that people knew who was doing the hunting and where they were doing it. Whaling, if they were going to a battle, held meetings, helped coordinate people drying the fish, things like this. Now, I want to talk a little bit, though, about gender roles, what those would have looked like in, let's say, the 1700s or early 1800s. And to a degree, we don't fully know, right? We're dealing partly with the stories and people's recollections of back then. However, we do know some things, at least with some degree of confidence, right? We think we know what was going on back then. And as I talk about traditional Sugpiaq roles, I want you to think about, would you call this a patriarchy or a matriarchy or something more egalitarian? So patriarchy, as in smash the, just kidding, that's a little Gen Z humor for you. But anyways, point is, patriarchy is a term we often use in anthropology as well as just broader English for kind of a male-controlled society, matriarchy for a female-controlled society, and then egalitarian I'm putting in there is kind of something where there's more equal sharing of power between sexes. What does Sugpiaq society sound like to you? If I was to tell the story to you this way, I could tell a story that would sound like this. Well, in traditional Sugpiaq society, the tujuk, the chief, were always male. The shamans were almost always male. And the men were in charge of hunting. They were in charge of constructing the kayaks that allowed you to get between islands. They were really in charge of any of the sort of outside of a village movement. So if you wanted to go to other places, right, that was often male facilitated. They had a rite of passage, as did women. However, in the female rite of passage, so rite of passage is a term we use for like a ceremony that's done when people transition from one role to another. And it is very common in Alaska Native groups for there to be rites of passage historically when somebody transitioned from sort of a boy into a man or a girl into a woman. For the female rite of passage, traditionally, there was a 6-month seclusion, after which time you had to dive 5 times in the water, re-enter the feast, and you had, during that time period, too, like certain prohibitions of what you could eat and how you could act. So if I told you all those facts, right, about the chief being male, about the shamans usually being male, about the men being the ones that would travel between villages more often, about the sort of seclusion that women had to do during their rite of passage, it would be very easy to think of this as, oh, that sounds really patriarchal, right? And if we were to say that there was a European culture that did this, I think our mind would naturally go to like, yeah, that sounds patriarchal, right? However, we could tell the story in another way from a female perspective and say, well, traditionally Sugpiaq society was matrilocal. And what we mean by matrilocal is that when a couple got married, they went and lived with the wife's family. The result of that being that villages had interconnected generational families of women, whereas men had to leave their villages to marry other and enter in homes in other villages, right? And so matrilocality, we tend to think kind of builds female empowerment to some degree, right? Because you kind of have a network of people that you're related to that you stick around with, whereas the men are coming in as outsiders. There was facial tattoos and headdresses that connoted people's status and their age and different things, their status, and sometimes things like elaborate headdresses specifically for daughters of chiefs. There was a variety of really important tasks that were women's tasks, including perhaps most importantly, the covering of the kayaks. So it's all great and everything if a man is building a kayak, but then the kayak needs to be covered so it does not take on water and sink. So really critical roles. And also like all sorts of other things as well, people harvesting of foods and things like that that were really critical to people's diets. Women could be the spiritual leader, although it was less common. And although they weren't chiefs, it's worth pointing out that a lot of the decisions that would have been made in a society like this, it's not like the chief was some dictator, right? The Tajuk, a lot of the decisions were just made by the community talking it out, as indeed many native societies in this area were, and women often had really prominent roles in those discussions. So, and it is also worth pointing out that although women were secluded after childbirth, one could view that not as a punishment, but instead as a way of ensuring that both mother and baby are healthy. So I bring that up to, and then the final thing I wanted to point out, which I did not write into the slide, but I really should have. So let me just do that right now. Is that property and land were controlled through female lines. They were matrilineal. So if you've lived most of your life in the States, and your ancestry tends to be European, then you're probably implicitly familiar with the concept of patrilineality, among other things, because it's very common in the States for people to inherit their father's name, but that's sort of connected to older historic practices of sort of inheriting property through the male line. By contrast, Sugpiaq society was and is matrilineal, with obviously traced descent through both lines, as in most societies, but with a heavier emphasis on your mom's line and with property and land moving through female lines. And so you say all of that, and it starts to sound a lot less patriarchal, right? And perhaps a lot more egalitarian, with different roles, but very powerful roles on both sides. Or perhaps if I was to only tell you this side and basically say, well, women owned all the property, and generally speaking, were the kind of the nucleus of the villages, that almost starts to sound matriarchal, right? And so I bring this up to point out that when we talk about, well, patriarchy or matriarchy, it's easy to try to lump categories or cultures into categories, but in reality, cultures are often considerably more complicated than easy, clear categories. It's also worth pointing out that perhaps trying to think of things in terms of solely sort of formal power dynamics might not be the most helpful way of thinking through what gender looked like in a society, that there are other ways to think about that topic, and that a lot of times sort of Western categories don't fit super well onto things. One could argue that they don't always even fit well onto Western cultures, much less trying to apply those to other cultures. And so that's all worth knowing. This is a quote from Stanik's Ethnographic Overview and Assessment for Non-Wallach in Port Graham. He says, the power of the female body was of paramount importance relative to the lives of everyone in the community. And it says, it brought new life into the community, and a significant amount of power was derived from the woman's ability to influence human interactions with wild animals, particularly in hunting. And in one instance, the power of a woman's body was able to save an entire community. And he tells his story that you can read on your own time. But one of the things is that they basically the community collected secretions, is what they're calling it, but basically menstrual fluid from people, and then putting that onto spears and using them to kill animals that were like a monster, like an octopus or thing that was killing people. And so this idea of sort of a supernatural power to people's monthly cycle, which I think is kind of fascinating, and also not limited to Sugpiaq, but found in other societies as well. By the way, it's also, just to even make this more complex, this issue of sort of gender and power and identity, there seems to have traditionally been the concept of aronotik, which often gets translated sometimes into English nowadays as two-spirit. The amount of information I've been able to find, and I'm not an expert on it, but the amount of information I've been able to find is pretty scant. It's pretty small. Some of the ways that it was described, this concept seems to be people's way of describing people who are intersex, but sometimes the way that it's being described is, it was people who were male but then lived lives as women, and vice versa. And so there's not a ton of information, and so people interpret that nowadays in a certain way. It's hard to know exactly what was going on 300 years ago, but at the very least, it's an acknowledgement of just kind of the complexity of how gender was thought of in Sugpiaq communities. I have a final kind of thing here. I've got some links for you that I want you to look at on your own time. I'm not going to do them right now. Again, that sort of showing a video of a video seems a little silly, but each of these are from a TikToker named Desia or Sierros, who is Sugpiaq from Chinega, a community that was unfortunately, very sadly, devastated by the 1864 Good Friday earthquake, and then some of them were able to refound kind of a new Chinega. So that will tell about that. And also this video from the Chinega Village Corporation from their website will also tell about that. And I think you'll really like those videos, and I encourage you to look at them. I don't generally recommend TikTok videos because I don't like TikTok, but these ones I think are really good. And there's a lot of good Alaska Native TikTokers that I think people are always like, oh, I want to know what it's like in these like remote villages. And it's like, great, like go on TikTok, right? Because there's a bunch of people, you search hashtag Alaska Native, and you have a bunch of people that are using their iPhones to show you exactly what it's like in a community like Chinega. So strongly recommend those videos. They're fantastic. One thing I kind of want you to end with, though, is I want you to think, as we've talked about Sugpiaq and Unangan, or Alutiiq and Aleut people, what things could we have predicted, knowing that these were coastal and island peoples traditionally, and what things could we not predict? So, for example, it was not surprising to find that kayaks were very important, or that people relied heavily on fish and marine mammals for their diets. And shellfish. What might be more surprising is things like how people thought about gender, right? And the complexities there, and how they decided how property gets passed down, right? That's not something you could predict. You can't be like, oh, somebody lives on an island, therefore they'll be matrilineal. And if they live inland, they'll be patrilineal. That's not how that works at all. And so there's a lot of things that environment shapes, and there's a lot of things that are independent of environment. And people's cultures are kind of a complex dance, a complex interplay between their environment, between the individual people involved in the culture who come up with their own ideas and ways of doing things, and a million other things. So I hope you found this a very interesting lecture. I certainly always find it really rewarding to delve more into Sugpiaq and Unangan culture. And so thank you very much for your time.